Welcome to Grief Uprooted, a podcast dedicated to sharing your grief stories. Together, we embark on the mystery of one's grief journey as they learn to live, heal, and be courageous in a world rooted in trauma. Join myself, Christine, in an open discussion to help you uproot the grief in all our lives. I am an award-winning author, professional speaker, and humanitarian in the field of grief and trauma. I want you to be part of the discussion. Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to Grief Uprooted. I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad that I want to start off by thanking you for putting your mental health first. Your presence here means so much to me, whether you're engaging with us on social media or you're sharing this episode with family and friends who may be grieving. Also, that your presence is helping this community grow and become bigger and stronger. So today's episode is truly special. I'm joined by the amazing Dr. Shahana. She's a TEDx speaker. She's actually a mental health advocate, a physician, a practicing physician, and an author of the powerful book, Feel Better. Her work has touched across the globe, from youth programs in British Columbia to mental health initiatives in Nepal. Her book is a heartfelt guide to living a greater acknowledgement, an awareness and acceptance of our emotions. You will understand why I'm so excited about her today, because it's all about that emotional awareness. And in grief, we talk about this and what do we do with these emotions? How do we acknowledge them? And really, do we spend time processing them? Which ones do we let go? Which ones do we bring closer? And how is this affecting us physically, emotionally, and spiritually? In today's episode, you're going to find the discussion to allow you to feel this continued support. And it's going to be one of resilience, emotional courage, strength, and really finding that in our vulnerability. I know that's a word a lot of us don't want to talk about, our vulnerability, but is there strength in that? Today's episode, I'm so happy you showed up, and I think we might be answering some of these questions. So let's go dive in. Thanks for tuning in today. But as usual, I have a question for you. My guest today is going to touch on emotional intelligence. I know a lot of you tuning in are saying emotions and intelligence, does that really go together? When we think about grief and that collapse and that sadness and that sorrow, is any of that intelligent? David Suzuki actually did an episode on emotions for Nature of Things, and they discovered that there's one emotion or one experience in our lives that completely collapses us. We have no control over how we're going to react. And you guessed it, grief. We really don't know how we're going to react. And today we're going to explore all of that. So I want to introduce you to Dr. Shahana. Thank you so much. Thank you
Thanks
for
for
joining
having
us.
me.
I'm so excited about it because everything that you're wanting to touch on is so much in the area of grief and what we're experiencing. But as usual, before we start, I always love to know what brought you to grief or your first experience to grief. Really, what have you ever experienced any form of grief in your life? And when I say form, and know everybody's listening right now, it can be anything.
Mhm.
So,
When we had spoken offline about this question as well, I think you think about the prototypical types of grief, which is really the loss of
mhm.
a loved one, that finality of things. And although, yes, that has happened to me in my life, the type of grief that is still something that I'm reckoning with today is the type of grief that has a big flavor of regret in it. So I
Mm.
think about my life 9 years beforehand and 9 years after. And that 9 years is marked by the birth of my first son, right? So he was born 9 years ago. And so much of my life, in a good and not so good way, has changed afterwards. And I think really that birth for me was the epitome of hitting rock bottom, right? For me, understanding this diagnosis that I had had since I was a little girl, which is called pure obsessional OCD, which is a subtype of obsessive compulsive disorder that comes about in a very strong way in the postpartum period. And trying to have suppressed that diagnosis for a large part of my life, and then it coming back, like many things. The more you try to suppress something, I always joke the postpartum period is a really fertile time for things to, uproot. And that's exactly what happened to me. So now when I see pictures of my son during that first year, on paper, it is beautiful. And it's got that unicorns and rainbows and glitter and sparkle component on paper. But internally, all I can remember is being that shell of myself. And I wonder if grief and regret go together because in some ways, I would do anything to go back. I would do anything to go back and be the mother that I wished I could have been at that time. Because what I should tell you about postpartum OCD is that one of the hallmark symptoms is the woman or parent has thoughts of could they hurt or harm their child. They don't want to have these thoughts. These are horrible, bring you to your knees kind of thoughts. But it's like the don't think of a purple elephant. You just have it over and over again. So you can imagine these types of thoughts, newborn baby, what do? You start avoiding your child. You start being scared of going next to your child. So that entire year plus was blemished by so much shame and so much sadness and trying to figure out how I was going to get out of it. Because truth be told, the only way I could fathom getting out of it was to end my life and not be here anymore. And that for me was the beginning. That was the beginning to start waking up to this and getting help.
That's your rock bottom.
That
It's
was
interesting.
absolutely.
Out of so many guests I've had on, and we talk about grief and all the different forms of grief. This one I particularly interesting is because a lot of times in my industry, we compare it to birth. And so grief, we use the symbol of a butterfly or water bugs to dragonflies and how you're transforming. And what I find interesting in your story or touching is that this was a beautiful moment. This was the birth of a child. And now as we have death doulas, we have, birthing doulas and which services are amazing. I've used both. And that birth of that child, I can go back to the when I gave birth to my three children. And I remember actually having the thought that I would have dropped the baby.
Yeah.
And I just was like, why do I have this thought? Right? It
Yeah.
would scare you.
Yeah.
And then to look back and think of regret. I know
Yeah.
so many times people talk about that in grief. Like, I should have spent more time. I should have focused more. I should have been happier. And I'm assuming that's where your regret is falling in there. And is that about right that you wished you would have enjoyed that time better?
Oh, and I think the key word there is should. I
Yeah.
don't play golf, but I remember golfing with my dad. And you think when you, as a little girl, I used to love the sand traps. I thought you wanted the ball to go in there because I wanted to play in the sand.
Yeah.
And those are your mental sand traps, the I should. I never get to. I always have to. But for me, it's the shoulds that really mark the why didn't I act differently during that time? Why didn't I seek help earlier? Why did it have to get to that point? But like we always say, hindsight is 2020. Sometimes you have to get to your rock bottom, whatever that happens to be for you, in order for you to slowly claw your way out. And I think regret and grief and mental health, which is kind of the what I speak on and what OCD is marred by, is this idea that it's never going to be a linear journey. The joke I always make is that none of this is a rash where a cream will fix it. Like as a physician, I can give you a cream for your eczema and usually it gets better. Nothing about grief, I'm assuming, regret, mental health kind of transitions in an A plus B plus C way. So I found that jagged nature of trying to recover and heal still to this day, it doesn't go away. It doesn't go away. It just stings a little bit less.
And I think what's so beautiful is when you are a doctor, a practitioner, and you know, to hear you talk like that, I know all of you that are listening right now are going, yes, because That's exactly it. It's an integration process. It's not a process we can get over. And in the first year of grief, Freud and Carl Jung, they all coined it as a time of sorrow. And that's why we have all the traditions like bereavement bands and things like that. But after a year in our mental health system here in Ontario, Canada, for that first year, there's really no help for you. It's a process you're going through. It isn't until it's been after a year that it's diagnosed as a mental illness or you need help. And so when you look at grief, it's well, who helps you? Who walks beside you in that period of time? And there isn't anything somebody can give you. They can give you a band-aid. We can take pills that are going to make us feel a little bit happier, bring up our dopamine and things like that. But the band-aid eventually comes off and you're stuck with that same level of grief. And some of the words you use, like shame, is huge. And I often struggle with the definition of it. And we do pinwheels of emotions. So that's how I often work with my clients and say, this is what grief is like. You're that center of that pinwheel, and each point is a different emotion. And the weather is grief. So some days you're like, you feel crazy and you think you're crazy. And from what you've described, it feels like that.
Yeah.
And then some days it just stops.
Yeah.
And you're like, I'm on regret. And I feel regret every day. But shame, that's a heavy word. And when you think of shame, describe that a little bit for me. Are you looking for that special keynote speaker? I'm Christine Dernetter-Landon, and thank you for joining us today. With over 25 years of experience and an award-winning author of 6 books, and the founder of Canada's Grief Resource Centre, I deliver a keynote that's not just one you listen to. You engage, you participate, and you transform. With vulnerability, courage, and strength, I am capable of creating a space for growth and healing. I also want to introduce you to Dr. Shahana, my guest today. She's a TEDx speaker and the author of Feel Better. She brings an awareness to emotional intelligence and mental health. Both Dr. Shahana and I are represented by speakerscanada.com. If you'd like to learn more about each of us and looking for that special keynote speaker, visit speakerscanada.com, Speakers Bureau of Canada.
When I think about shame, I think about it's almost like this deep-seated fear of not being worthy enough to fill in the blank, right? So for me, a lot of the times it was feeling like I would never, because of this OCD, I would never be worthy enough to actually experience what true happiness or true joy actually felt like, because I had this elephant on my back, because I was so ashamed of having this potent diagnosis, or at least what I felt. And the irony about it too is that the minute that I'll never forget the first time I spoke to a colleague. She wasn't a friend, she wasn't an acquaintance, she was just a colleague. And we were both struggling to finish our notes at the end of the day. And all the patients had left. And I don't know how it all transpired, but she had come into my office to discuss a case. And I told her my story. And I actually, for the first time, used the right words. I didn't say anxiety. I didn't say depression, because those were the symptoms of the OCD. That was not the diagnosis, the symptoms of it. And I told her, I said, I have postpartum OCD. And she looked at me and she used the word, she's like, me too. Not that she had the same diagnosis. It was that she had also been through her own version of a struggle that I would later come to know when she was vulnerable enough to share it with me too. But it's interesting because empathy and compassion erodes shame. Suddenly, I felt that grip loosen on me. That thing that I didn't want to share with anybody, by her just whispering those words in my ear, I'm like, that feeling of not being alone actually corrodes that feeling of I am the only one. Shame puts you in the category where you are only and alone. And I think that is what makes it so incredibly isolating.
So true, so true. And well, well described, because that is exactly what happens. And
Mhm.
then we start to go down the rabbit hole
Yeah.
farther and farther.
Yeah.
In your story, though, you end up expressing that, you got to the end where you felt suicidal.
Mhm.
Um, what really brought you, like, describe that one for me.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. And I think the context is everything, right? So knowing that I'm a physician and worked for over a decade in mental health, I work in all aspects of medicine, but a lot in adolescent mental health. And when you deal with mental health, of course you deal with passive and active suicidality. So knowing that that was something that I deal with all of the time and understand people's lexicon in terms of how they talk about suicidality, you would think that I would have a little bit of a better inkling to recognize some of those own inner dialogue that I was having with myself. But it just shows you when you wear your professional hat, when you wear your big girl pants and go out,
Yep.
you can be a certain way. And it's almost, I think the reason I bring this up is sometimes the more privilege you have, the more professional aspect you have, the more letters behind your name actually can make you more susceptible, not more
Exactly.
bulletproof. I think that is really important for us to understand because, we kind of look towards certain people, you're fine, you got it all together, but do you? Like, do you really? And I think I bring women into this conversation because I think women do a lot and are expected to do a lot as well, too. And for me, it was driving. I don't think I've ever shared this story before. It was driving one day and having a very, very, very clear, precise, clean thought
Hmm.
that this is it. I'm just going to drive onto oncoming traffic, and that's what was going to happen. And it was almost like my body wanted to do it, but my mind stopped me, or you could think of it
Yeah.
vice versa. Um, and that was that rock bottom. You always think that you fall into your rock bottom, but there's sometimes a little bit more to go. It's like
I
when
know.
like when you squeeze toothpaste out of the container. Oh no, there's still a
There's
little
a
bit
little
more.
more.
Yeah, exactly. So that's exactly how it was. No, a little bit more. You can get a little bit lower. And I think the next day I called the anonymous physician helpline. No, notice I say anonymous physician helpline. I
Yeah.
didn't have the courage or the guts to go to my own family doctor. She was a friend of mine. She was a colleague. So that's where ego comes into play. Like I
Yeah.
think ego fuels shame, right? I think those
Yeah.
two things go hand in hand. Compassion
Mhm.
and empathy erode those two things, but my ego just fueled all of this. Like I would have died for my ego because I didn't want anybody to mar the biggest fear I had, which was the fear of imperfection. That's
No.
what got me through medical school, and that's what got
Yeah.
me into medical school.
No.
Both, right? So I was calling that anonymous physician helpline, making that call and explaining my story. And the lady on the other end, she's like, you're going to have to see a reproductive psychiatrist, right? You're going to need to start medication, right? You're going to have to do counseling, right? And I said, you know what? This conversation has made me feel so much better. I think I'm completely cured. Thank you so much.
Click.
Click. I'm done. Like, don't, that's the work.
Yeah.
It's one thing to reconcile, pick up the phone.
Yep.
Then comes this version of the work. And the work, once again, is not linear.
No.
I joke now with my patients, finding a counselor can very much be like finding the right medication. Don't discount one counselor because it wasn't a good fit for you. That's discounting an entire profession, an entire wealth of techniques. Don't do that. I could never have said that unless I had sat before countless therapists, counselors, psychologists, trying to figure out what worked for me at what time. Every time is different. So that was really important for me. And it was continues to be a long uphill, sometimes downhill battle where you're kind of oscillating up and down too. But the only difference
Mhm.
between that pregnancy and my two other sons that came afterwards was that I started to be a lot more open and use the correct words. And the first podcast I ever did that someone she cornered me. She said, "Is it anxiety or is it like she literally put and I said the words and I thought something was about to implode on me
Yeah.
and nothing happened.
Yep.
Nothing happened.
And I
So,
think that's one of
yeah,
the key things where you're speaking to more than, uh, you know, we're all grieving in life. Some of us
yeah,
just don't realize it, but professionals in the field,
yes.
police officers, they use numbers when
Mhm.
they're going to seek help
Yeah.
because everybody wants it anonymous. The suicide rate in police is unreal, and firefighters. and EMS, and these places all have a system now where anonymously you can go do this, very much
Yeah.
like what you did.
Yeah.
But it is once the work starts,
Yeah.
then people are like, oh no, like people are going to know this is going to be horrible, right? I joke around all the time because when I walk into a room, people avoid me. And I used to get very offended, but after 25 years, I'm like, oh, I get it. You think I'm going to talk about my job, right? And I think, oh, I love my job, right? But
Yeah.
it is when you've worked in world tragedies and things like that, people then think, oh, she's going to talk about it or she's going to be, and it's like, no, this is my career. But it really started off as a hobby and a passion. And I know that sounds insane, but it was something that was very dear to my heart. And then to realize that I'm not alone in my grief, where you're not alone in your grief, and to see this happens. Like there are so many people out there that really just disassociate and go, well, that's not grief. That was just, me having a hard time after I had a baby. And it's like, no, this is debilitating. This can take over. This can destroy lives. And I think the amount of strength and courage you show in sharing the story is, will go way beyond this podcast because so many people are just afraid to bring the conversation up and talk about it. So I admire and condemn and commend you for all of that. When does like forgiveness step in? Like how many years and having more children after that? I think that's like you just wanted a glutton for punishment or something. Just throw myself. This will be exposure therapy. I know exactly all about that.
You're
um,
so right. Yeah.
yeah, like when do you kind of go, yeah, like when did the thought come to have another baby after the first hurdle of this? I'm
Yeah.
curious when the mind went, hey, let's do it again.
Totally. Well, the irony of it all is that about a year after my first son was born, I was running and I noticed some pain. Whatever, not a big deal. Didn't think much of it. Pain continued to happen and finally had got booked for a pelvic ultrasound. And it's never, as being a doctor, it's never a good thing when the radiologist comes into the room when they're doing the pelvic ultrasound. So the
Mm.
technician went away. The radiologist looked at me and she's like, we've seen something on your ovary. It doesn't look good. She's like, it's a 10 centimeter mass. And we're going to send you to oncology. And hopefully you can get seen there soon. So this is like, okay,
Oh,
sure. Like, here we go. Went to VGH oncology. They were like, likely is okay, but we're not sure. We're gonna take it out. And then the doctor comes in, examines me. She's like, oh yeah, this doesn't feel good at all. I'm like, thanks for that. That's really reassuring. A couple of weeks later, went for surgery. It was 10 centimeters. They took the ovary with it, so it lost an ovary. Luckily, who cares about the ovary? Thank goodness it was overall benign. So that was the biggest part there. And having one ovary down, the doctor was like, yeah, I'm sure everything will be fine. But, if you want to have kids, you should think about having kids soon, right? And the next month we were pregnant with our second. So it really, and his name means the gift of God. So he was just, I think, out a little bit out of fear, desperation, being told that this might not happen for you. And my third son, as to this day, we affectionately call him the Beast. He is like a little ogre man. He's our little surprise. He came out of the womb with his punching gloves on, like, third
yeah.
son.
I'm
Like,
here.
I'm here. Like, I am here. So his motto of the day is that, like, I'm going to punch you and then ask you what happened. Like, like that's kind of what he
Did
does.
that hurt?
Did that hurt? Like, and I don't blame him. His two older brothers are pretty tough and feisty too. But I joke with my husband. I'm like, I think I kept having kids to prove to myself that I am a good mom every single time. But it is like, it was equally as hard because God doesn't give you the same baby, like gives you different baby with different traits and different characteristics. But like I said, I think similar to grief, the only difference was me using some humor, and humor opened up the idea of compassion. So you talk about forgiveness. Humor was the gateway where I could even start to see this in a different light. Like my husband and I will joke going, oh, is the OCD? Because the OCD is still there. Just because I don't have a baby doesn't mean that it's not there. And it's still harm-related OCD. So now if my husband sees my expression, he's like, oh, another OCD thought, you okay there? And we can just laugh about it
Yeah.
versus me crying in the corner. But yeah, so talking to myself in a more forgiving, kind way, humor allowed that.
Yeah. So
Yes.
true. So true. I didn't, it's so many times. You remind me of a time I was delivering a keynote speech and I was on stage and I was engaging with the audience.
Yeah.
And somebody actually stood up and said, I want to share my experience.
Mm,
And as he started talking, it was quite horrific, but the audience didn't know what to do because he was saying it in such a way that it was humorous. And we were all standing there, and I thought, how do I approach this? Because even I was like, oh my goodness. And it really was, but somebody had died in this. And and it was work related. It was for a corporation. And I just remember stopping and saying, we've got to acknowledge why we're laughing.
yeah.
And I said, it's so uncomfortable, but at the same token, this is what's making it tolerable.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is what's making us to have compassion for each other.
Mm,
And it's kind of like one of those things where they say you're either going to laugh or cry. And the crying will just take us down, where the laughter is causing us to look at each other and have that compassion and that forgiveness. And, that
exactly.
community starts to develop. So
Absolutely.
I think people often, when they're talking about grief or, anything like that,
Yeah.
they always put laughter off to somewhere else. And I'm like, believe it or not, it's part of grief. Because sometimes you're just like, I can't believe this is happening to me.
Happening. Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
holy shit,
Yeah.
like, what
Oh,
do I do? Like,
completely.
yeah,
Completely.
it
Yeah.
completely can take you off.
Yeah.
We're just going to take a small break. I would love to then see what your approach is with your patients. And then I definitely want to touch on emotional intelligence and what's an invisible chalkboard. So we will be right back.
We interrupt this podcast for a dirty moment.
So in our family house, we have pictures constantly revolving on a frame. And I lost my grandmother about a year and a half, 2 years ago. And there'll be certain moments in the day where sometimes I'll feel like I'm talking to her in my head, whether it be cooking a favorite recipe or just wanting her advice. And no joke, during those times, I'll see her picture over and over and over again on this frame. And it hasn't been set that way. It's just somehow it's auto-selected that her picture just comes up. And it's like her telling me that I'm here. I've got you, as if she's tapping me on my shoulder. And in those moments, sometimes what I'll do is do a butterfly hug. And it's something really simple where you go like this. You can do it on your legs too, but for this purpose of the screen, I'll show you. And you just simply tap like this. And it reminds me of her giving me a hug, but it's also a really great calming technique. It was designed for hurricane victims. And simply you breathe while you're tapping yourself on both sides. It allows those emotions to pass. And most importantly, it allows me to feel like she's embracing me.
That was beautiful. What a good one. Okay, welcome back. Thank you for sharing and being so honest and so vulnerable with your story. Absolutely so courageous. You're very strong. You can see that. As much as you talk about your OCD, you can see the strength there. One of the things I really want to touch on is how has this affected your approach to your patients? Like, how are we approaching this? Is it any different than how we approached it before? I would assume it would make you an excellent physician.
You know, the story I like to tell is that growing up, like my parents came to this country as refugees, right? They were thrown out of Uganda by Idi Amin. They came here with only $50. And, like many immigrant stories, they really, really worked to
Yeah.
make this country and to tell us how lucky we are to be here too. But growing up, I remember these instances where we'd be going to the mall, and those kids that hang out in front of the mall, like those kids, right? They're always like a version. If I told you that, you can kind of conjure up an image of maybe tattoos. And at that time, it was smoking. At this time, it's vaping. Maybe they were swearing a bit too much, like all the things, right? So
My father has a name for them. They're a bunch of punks. Remember
yeah.
from the 80s, the punks.
So
Right?
yeah, yes, exactly. And I just, not that my mom or my dad ever told us this explicitly, but it was kind of like when you see those types of kids, you cross the road. Like you don't go on to the same
You
side.
don't hang out with them.
Hang out, like you just cross the road. You get away from that. So
Yeah.
there was this kind of stereotype. So then fast forward to, when you do medical school, then you do residency to become a family physician. And I had a mentor, and my mentor's name is Dr. Watt. And
Mm,
she was the head of the women's penitentiary. So basically for women who were serving anywhere from 2 to life in the prison. And that's the program that she ran for many years. And she had a heart for vulnerable and marginalized populations. So she
mm,
started the Youth Health Center, which is now the Foundry. And I'm the director of that now. I took over for her. And we see youth between the ages of 12 and 24. But going back to that mall story, the irony was that those were my first patients. It was that, like, that's sort of who I was serving. And
yeah.
suddenly I'm like, this is very uncomfortable for me. First of all, how do I talk to you? Second of all, you're not laughing at any of my jokes, like all of these types of
Mm,
things. And then I realized that when I got one by one behind a closed door, they were just like me. They were just like anyone else. And I think I fell in love with being able to see the person behind the facade, right? By seeing the person behind the clothing or the person behind the smoking or the vaping or any of those types of things that create a bit of an illusion to who that person is. And these were good, honest, amazing kids, many of whom had been dealt a difficult card in their life,
yeah.
right? Many of whom didn't choose the path, who were given certain circumstances, and here they were. So I think that is now taking that population, it would be very, very easy because we deal with mental and sexual health as the top 2 complaints. We deal with everything else. But in terms of mental health, I joke with my patients that me writing you a sertraline prescription or a Prozac prescription takes me 2 seconds. Like signing my name is
Yeah.
not the hard work. The hard work is asking you why and why now? Why
Yeah.
now have you decided to present? Right? And tell me your story. So we
Mm,
get paid by the hour, not by the patient, which is
yeah.
really important to point out because it's not a 6.5 minute revolving door. I call that fast food medicine. Put
Yeah.
in a cough, get an antibiotic. Put in a rash, get out a hydrocortisone prescription, right? Sometimes there is a role for fast food vending machine medicine. That is fine. But mental health is not one of those things. So going back to the idea that when I walked through my own journey with mental health, when the bee actually stung me and I felt how painful that was, I
Yeah.
realized that medical school didn't teach me anything about the power of my emotions. So
Yeah.
now being able to speak to patients and teach them a couple of tools that they can use, that is the preventative aspect to mental health. That's what will keep
Mm.
them well. And I truly believe that.
Oh, I love that. Like I often say to people with grief, I see people naked and they'll say, what do you mean?
Mhm.
You're stripped of all that.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
when I get to work with people, the way they dress, the way they look, the color of
yeah,
their skin, their culture, whatever, it's the only thing in life that doesn't discriminate.
yeah,
And I get to see that whole person behind the facade.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And it's beautiful
Mhm.
because you see that vulnerability. Um, and when you talk about really having been raised a specific way, it sounds like you kind of have to look at your own inner child and go, hey, like, you know what? This was passed down. This is my generation. And, we often talk about generational grief. And sometimes I think that's what it is, where,
Mhm.
we have these ideas in our head that this is the way I was raised, this is what I
Yes.
was told. And then all that's challenged on top of it. Especially as women, I have 2 daughters, and I don't know how many times I have to explain myself and go, well, we never did that in my, well, why not? Well, you just didn't, right? You didn't just,
Yeah,
you didn't. I know you want me to stand up, but we never did it, right? So it's all new to me.
yeah,
And my inner child is telling me this is not good. Like, so I think it's so interesting how, grief does go through generations,
yes.
and being able to look at these youth and say, hey, tell me why now.
Mhm.
Often in different cultures, people will say, well, this is the history of my family. They've all lived on the street. So now I live on the street.
Yeah,
So there's no different. And being able to have that conversation is so huge, a prescription in itself, right? Being able to talk to somebody.
exactly,
Um,
exactly,
when you
exactly.
talk about emotional intelligence,
Yeah,
um, I'm wondering how the two words go together,
yeah.
especially in the area of grief. Um, because yeah, I just some days I think I've had a lot of people say my emotions have taken over.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
and it seems like well, I'll say it in society that if you're emotional, and I usually never make it through a podcast without crying, and I often will go, and then I'll go, I'm not saying I'm sorry, right? Because it's just my body's reacting to what I'm feeling. And I think it's looked upon as weak. As much as we keep saying out there, like watching a man cry, strength beyond strength.
Yeah.
Having people share these stories and be able to cry and keep talking. I often tell my children if I come home from deployment or aiding community in grief, I'll say, Mom's eyes are going to cry and I'm going to be able to talk through it. It's just my soul. My soul hurts and it needs to let go what it picked up. And so we just do that. We'll go shopping and they'll be like, oh, here she goes again. And I'll be like, I'm fine. I'm just, and I really can't put a specific story to it. I can't put anything to it. I'm just like, I feel like this.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and I just want to let it go. So when you talk about intelligence, I do not feel intelligent when I'm doing that. So I would love to know what this means.
Yeah. Oh, but just in your story there, I want everyone to picture for a second a seesaw, right? We all
Mhm.
know the prototypical seesaw, right? So that's a great metaphor for emotions. So in our life, we're supposed to have feelings, obviously,
Yeah.
and we're supposed to regulate. So think of the toddler, which I kind of still have at home,
Yeah.
and the teenager, right?
Yeah.
Both of those usually have high feelings and maybe not so great regulation skills.
Non-regulation.
Yeah, exactly. Not really great.
None.
Prefrontal cortex still needs to be developed.
Yeah.
Now, and then think of us as humans, or as adults, I should say. We actually don't, we've forgotten how to feel and we hyper-regulate.
Oh, so
See
true.
the difference, right? So the quote that I often say is that we don't suffer from an epidemic of anxiety or depression. We suffer from an epidemic of not being willing to feel
Yep.
anything at all. That's what we do. Languishing, numbness. The three most, and there's no study to prove this, this is from 10 years of working in mental health: guilt, boredom, and numbness.
Oh.
Those are the three things that I often see where something is lingering, something is lurking in the background. What you've described there is allowing yourself to feel, right? You're getting a balanced seesaw, saying, I can feel what I need to feel. And if regulating is through allowing it to actually come out versus what I and many people love to do, which is stuff and suppress way down deep, that's the hyper regulation. And no wonder why then when you go home and you drink 2 to becomes 4, becomes 5 glasses of wine, or it's binging on Netflix, or it's many other things that we do, so we don't need to feel anything at all, right?
Yeah.
So that's the intelligence part comes in, not by not feeling, but trying to know what your emotions are trying to convey to you. Think back to your Girl Guides days or Scouts days when you'd be out trying to use that compass.
Yeah.
That's what emotional intelligence is. Looking at your emotions and going, what the heck, which direction is it pointing me in? Because if you feel something strongly, you can be sure that somewhere lurking there is something that is significant to you. And that's my job, I feel, as a parent, as a physician, as a coach, to go. Values, I think we talk about, it's a very pie in the sky esoteric idea.
Yeah.
Get down and dirty, ask yourself what pisses you off. Then something actually stirs up your emotion. So the intelligence is the compass analogy. If that kind of brings.
Interesting. And I think for myself, what
Yeah.
has really in university, I studied the effects of grief on the physical body.
Okay.
After my brother had died, I had fallen and hit my leg. And then I had osteomyelitis. They thought I had cancer in my legs at 14. And I just remember Dr. McIntyre wheeling me in the room. I too, at that time, was at a suicidal state and said, please don't wake me up. And when he woke me up, he said, sunshine, because I had big curly red hair. And he says, I don't know what is hurting you, but you're allowing it to physically kill you. He goes, whatever's inside of you, you're allowing it to hurt you because you're not talking. And I use a jar now when I work with people and I put Annie in it. Everyone thinks I look like Annie, or the kids are like, they made a doll of you. No, it was out in my time. And I put her in a jar because after my brother died, that's where I lived. So I'm understanding emotion intelligence now is because I lived in the jar. So it would pop off every once in a while, and I would kind of like,
Yeah, exactly.
and I had rock posters. I loved heavy metal. Of course I did, right? And I pinned them all over my mother's English wallpaper in this bedroom she made for me because if tape would rip her wallpaper off. And I would literally imagine a jar opening, rip all my posters down, blare rock music, and then stick the jar back on, the lid back on, and live in the jar. And ultimately caused me to be physically ill. And then my career started because I was like, the jar broke. And it was like, I can't live my life like this. And so I love that hearing you say the intelligent part. With my clients, we do chain analysis where, okay, you're feeling this right now. Let's follow it backwards. Tell
Yeah.
me where this is leading. When's the first time you felt like this? And usually it's back in childhood. And then when's the second time? And eventually we realize that that emotion is really an indicator that something is wrong.
Yeah.
So you can call it a red light. You can call it something that, hey, let's wake up, let's take note, and maybe let's sit with it.
Yes.
But
Yes.
I don't believe anybody does that anymore.
Because the feeling part, going back to that seesaw, is at rock bottom. We don't want to feel anything uncomfortable, which makes, we were speaking about the topics, obviously, of grief and mental health and the things that we both co-speak on. And I think both of these topics encompass there's no such thing as a good or bad emotion. There's just comfortable or uncomfortable. But to do the work, going back to the work, it's not barking up the tree of comfortable emotions, it's digging into the uncomfortable emotions. And that's really hard.
But once you get it, that's the part that I find so great is people will say it's not going to come through like an epiphany. It actually does feel like an epiphany because it's like you do all this groundwork and you go through, you slow yourself down, you go through these emotions, you go, okay, where's this taking me? You can journal about it. You can do pinpoints. I love to just talk into my phone. And then all of a sudden, you'll be hit with the same situation again. And it goes boom, 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 boom. And you're like, how did I know that? How did I? And it's because you did the work, but it feels like all of a sudden it worked. And I think that's why so many times, you'll hear someone speak or you'll go, well, how are they doing it? How are they getting there? And really all that legwork has been done in the background, just as you're sharing with your story. I went to this, I did this, I had to go here. And now, obviously we see you and we're like, wow. And that's because all this work was done. It was like you planted all these seeds and you dug in and kept going and kept going. And then eventually it's like the body, mind, and spirit go ding, 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 ding. We're here. We get it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's actually quite amazing to experience. And I can see that in yourself too. Like it's great when you kind of go, okay, I get this.
I get
And
that.
the fear can be let go of when you see there's so many other people like you.
Yes, exactly. But the isolation breeds fear, right? Feeling like I joke with my patients, you are unique as a snowflake, but nobody wants me to look at you and go, oh, I've never seen that before. Like you don't want to be that, right? You want to be common that goes, yes, I've walked a patient through this. I know where we're going. I'm next to you, right? And that's that community aspect. That's that feeling like you described that man standing up and sharing his story that you all were collective at that time. There is something there that you know that you are going to be caught if you fall. And we don't allow ourselves to fall anymore because we're just stuck in this route. I'd rather not try than ever fall and be caught.
So true. So true. Now you talk about the invisible chalkboard related to grief. I'm curious what that is. I love your seesaw analogy, and these are great tools for my listeners because I know you're all writing it down. And it's so hard to it's great when we can give grief a visual.
Yes.
That just makes things a little easier to process. So, what is it about a chalkboard?
Yeah. So one day I was, of course, we as both the speakers, we fly a lot, and one day I was on a plane to Hamilton and sitting beside this lovely couple. And, the first thing I did is not in a bad way. I judged the couple. They were holding hands, they were tanned, they looked lovely. And right away I thought, okay, they're obviously madly in love, and who still holds hands on the plane? You must be newly married, because we
Yeah.
don't do that. Yeah, exactly. I'd be
Who does
married.
that?
Who does that anymore? Like, my husband and I have been married for like 13 years. We don't do that anymore. And then she told me that they'd come back from 2 weeks cruising around some hot spot. And the
Oh.
next kind of descriptive was like, you obviously are financially secure enough to do that. Fair. Like, I wasn't even conscious to all of these biases, but they were kind of running through my mind. So she asked me, what are you doing in Hamilton? And of course, I told her about speaking and the work that I do. And I relayed a story to her of a patient that I'd recently seen at the Foundry who came in when she was pregnant at the age of 15, had no idea how far along she was, didn't know if she wanted to proceed with the pregnancy, but had been drinking very, very, very heavily for the past few months. So this lady beside the plane turned to me and said, I was that girl. And that was the response. I was not thinking of it all. I was like, sorry, what? She's like, no, I got pregnant when I was 15 myself. She went on to describe how she got pregnant at 15 and at 17 had to drop out of school, how she wasn't afraid about raising two young kids because she was, a product of a single mom and had to raise all her siblings, but she was really worried about her schooling. So she went back to get her master's of social justice in her late 20s, hated her job. And then she kind of paused and she's like, and then I lost my sister. I lost my sister a couple of months ago to triple negative breast cancer. And it was her that told us to use all of our savings that we have and finally go on this trip.
Nice.
So it was just this collapse of what is clinically called fundamental attribution error, right? Looking at someone and saying, like, think about the example when you cut someone off in traffic. You can say, I'm late for my kid's doctor's appointment, but if someone cuts you off in traffic, you're a jerk, basically, right? We give ourselves the benefit of the doubt, but we make stories up about people very implicitly. That's where the invisible chalkboard comes in, right? So I had created all of this story with regards to her, and one by one, she knocked it down about the death of her sister, about what she had gone through as a child, about how this partner next to her, they were actually recently married as well, like all of these things. And I think there are certain professions, more than you think, where you can get to someone's invisible chalkboard, i.e., what is going on in their work, their relationships, grief, their own health, are they in pain, their financial status, very, very quickly. And I imagine all of us floating around life with this chalkboard on our forehead. And if only we could have an authentic conversation, because most of the times what you want me to see and vice versa is that I'm fine, but you're not.
I love with the chalkboard that you can erase it, right? I can erase it and put the actual story. It's funny because a lot of when I'm speaking and you're on that plane, you talk to people all the time because you're alone. I totally can relate to this experience.
Yes.
And I remember a gentleman next to me, and we had hopped from plane to plane to plane, and we were going out to Alberta. And it was like, I never ran so fast in my life because the next plane was and we became friends, and it was like a whole bunch of us were running. And I had created a story about this young man, and I thought, oh wow, he's probably going to college and all this type of stuff, right? I had this whole great story for this kid, right?
Yes.
And here I am 52, and I'm like, oh, he's like going off and everything. And then he's like, my grandma died. And I was like, oh, right. Well, then, they had a whole story of me. And I was like, what? And I was like, you're focused on the red hair way too much. I was like, no. And I laughed my butt off. And, because I thought, wow, that's what you think of me. And so we were able to have that conversation, but you never do. And people kind of discourage you. I love talk. I talk a lot. You all know that. And I love talking about things that we're not supposed to talk about. And I don't know how many times, like, my children are older, getting married now, and they're like, okay, mom, I got it. Don't talk about this, and no loud outfits, right? And I'm like, totally talking about that. And I'm totally wearing a loud outfit, right?
Exactly.
But I laugh because I say to them, if we have these conversations, it's so much easier. And it's so much easier. And I worked at a youth home, and I took a contract there to help them in the area of trauma. And your chalkboards remind me of that gender equality, our identity. These are things in this generation that are questioned quite often. So, and can change. They're very fluid. So we flow with it. It can change daily. My real name is Nikki.
Yes.
And often shared that people thought I was a boy. I love motorcycles. So it was switched to Christine, my middle name, which then I hyphenated it to Chris. So, my poor mother. And it's so I'm like, but it's all good, Mom. It's all good.
Yeah.
But we use chalkboards outside the room.
Oh,
So I said, please identify for me who
yeah.
you are today and
Yeah.
how you're feeling. So
Yeah.
the chalkboards became just a little thing outside their door. They lived there. It was kind of like juvie. And they were able to put their name, they were able to put how they felt. And that just kind of gave us and the counselors that I was working with a meter to
Yeah.
go, and if nothing's on the board, well, then we know they're feeling nothing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's an indication too.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
I think it's such a great way and a great tool to not only visualize, but you could actually do that at home with your children. If you're in the process of grieving and you buy that little chalkboard and you can say, just tell me how you're feeling today.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and you don't have to verbalize it. So my last question to you, because I'm very curious, is with emotional intelligence, what do you think it brings to grief? And also the book that you've written. I kind of want to explore how that came about, the title and where we can buy it. Obviously, we're going to have it on robertspress.com, and I'll put the link in the notes of this podcast. But tell me how that all came about.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I love to ask youth this question, and it's probably not a normal question that a physician would ask, but I often ask them, do you care about yourself? Right? I need to know that, just ask me, to tell me that. And I don't say love, I don't say anything like that. But I had youth after youth, patient after patient give me the same answer. And it was
No.
always Dr. Alibhai, I swear word, swear word, swear word, hate myself.
Hmm.
Always the same answer, always the same answer. And I couldn't help but think, here we want, I was so passionate about emotional literacy, and the bedrock to emotional literacy is self-awareness. It's so easy for me to say, just be more self-aware, just name your emotion. Like, what? That's like going into Monica's closet and saying, I don't want to go in there. Like, no wonder it's easy for me to dish out the advice.
Yeah.
But then the premise of the book, if you get nothing else out of it, is that self-acknowledgement precedes self-awareness, crosses the bridge to self-compassion. So that is the sequence that we often just want to talk about self-awareness and understanding our emotions and using the emotion as a compass, and all of that is great, but you need to develop and understand an iota of self-acknowledgement, which for some of us is very, very, very low. And the analogy I give is, are you a glass or are you a rubber ball that you get from the dentist, right? Can you bounce quickly when your boyfriend breaks up from you, when you don't make the soccer team, when you fail an exam, or do you shatter like glass? And I give the analogy to youth, but adults are the same way. So
That's
how
great.
does one develop self-acknowledgement? I truly believe it's retrospectively. It's looking back in time and asking yourself, have you been through similar things? Have you been through harder things? And what traits, characteristics, values did you need to get through that? That is the intelligence, and that is doing the work.
That is so true. And that's that we coined it dirty moments, but it's those triggers, being
Yeah.
able to stop and go, okay, I've been here before.
Yeah.
And what did I do here before? And how
Yeah.
did I react?
Yeah.
I love the shatter and the ball, because so many times, are you bouncing back? And I know that a lot of times when I'm talking to youth and also adults, when it comes to grief, it's basically fuck this shit,
Yeah. Yeah.
because
Yeah.
it is like, really, even sometimes I find myself when I'm describing something to somebody and it's so emotionally filled. Anthony Robbins used to talk about this, and I remember the day that he had said, you swear sometimes when you're delivering a keynote for impact, because you're like, this is crazy,
Yeah.
right? Like, this is crazy. And how do I get it across to you
Yeah.
that this is crazy? So many times people will be like, I'm so sorry, but this is fucking nuts, right? And I'll be like, it's okay. I get it. I
Yeah.
get where this language is coming from. And I think with youth, you really have to be open to that,
Yeah. Oh,
because It is just that's their way of going, this is like, I don't have the words.
Don't have, and that's right. It's like putting like all of those exclamations, big
Yeah.
highlighter to tell me. It's like that, and it's in some ways it's a cry for help to go, do you understand how severely famished I am in this department in my life? Do you know the words that these kids are starving for is I am proud of you. I
Yeah.
am proud
So
of you.
true.
I'm proud of you. Right? So I say that all the time. And it could be for the smallest things. You handed your assignment. I'm proud of you for that, right?
Yeah.
And it's not just, always, we could go back to growth mindset and all of that sort of stuff. But in this case, yeah, we need to start at those baby steps. And you see them just light up.
No, that's so true. Well, I'm proud of everybody here for joining us today. So where do we find this book? Is it on Amazon?
Yes, on Amazon. Yeah, yeah, you can get it on Amazon. I read the Audible for it. So if you prefer listening, it's
Oh,
on
nice.
Audible as well. Yeah, so that was really a
I
fun
love that.
experience.
Yeah.
And then obviously a Kindle edition too.
Perfect. Perfect. And the title again,
Oh, sorry, it's called Feel Better.
I was
How
going to say,
under
there it is.
Yeah, exactly. It's a big umbrella. You can see it
Yeah.
on. Yeah.
Feel better.
Yes.
I can't thank you so much for joining us today. I've loved the conversation. I think that it brings so much to it. And um, it's just amazing to meet somebody like yourself who's a practitioner, who's a doctor, you're actually seeing this, realizing that it impacts our health. We hear it all the time, but to actually meet somebody and go, wow, you're approaching your patients like this. It's amazing. I love the work that you're doing. Absolutely love it.
Thank you so much. Thank
As
you.
much as I'm saddened by what experience you had after you had your children, I somewhat love it because look how great you are. Look how amazing you are right now. Let's just note that, right? Look at where you've come and what you're delivering to other people. Absolutely wonderful.
Well, thank you
Beautiful.
for having this. And even I'll have to be honest, I was a little bit nervous being on this podcast. I've been on tons on mental health and emotional health. Grief still has that, oh, like, can I do this? Can I handle this? But
Yeah.
you approach it with such grace, with such humor, and it's a really refreshing aspect on a topic that often is so stigmatized. So, no,
Yeah.
thank you for this.
Perfect. Well, as usual, it is only together that we grieve, and it is only together that we heal. Thanks for tuning in today. Take care, everybody. Grief Uprooted professional grief and empowerment coaching are not to be used as a substitute for professional advice by legal, medical, financial, business, spiritual, or other qualified professionals. All our products and services are designed for grief empowerment through learning and sharing of one's lived experiences.